So far, all the different periods that we have looked at, or countries we've visited, or styles that we've looked at, have been collaborations amongst the design community, artists, designers, architects, builders. In this case, we're now going to look specifically at the career of one person, which we have not done so far. And the reason for that is that he founded the Prairie School and ultimately the Prairie style of architecture. So, looking at the Prairie style and at Frank Lloyd Wright at the same time is helpful in understanding the evolution of from where he started, which was mostly craftsman style houses, and how it developed into its own style. And obviously that is him. And you can see he is on this massive table, drafting table, back before, long before there was CAD. He was born in Wisconsin. And when he was a child, he played with blocks, as many of us played with Legos. And so he said later on that obviously working with those blocks, because they're massing shapes, right? If you think about just childhood blocks, just think about regular blocks, they are massing forms. And by playing with that during his formative years, when he was very young, it allowed him to see visually in a way that probably put his visual cognitive spatial abilities, I knew I could work that in there somewhere, very, very high on the spectrum. He probably was 100% visual or close to it. And so when you start looking at his designs, you start to see that he had the ability to form these arrangements fully in his mind before he put them out on paper. And that is partly behind his genius. So it's really interesting how the things that we do early in our lives during our formative years can help shape our futures and our careers. And for him, it did. If you ask people to name an architect, in fact, when I was in college in the 1990s, actually 1980s, I graduated in 90, there was a study that somebody put out, or a survey that somebody put out, and it was basically asking people to name an architect because it was a big joke about how anonymous the profession is in general. If I said to you, name a song artist, you could name multiples. But when you start saying to people, name an architect, most people can't name any. But if they can, Frank Lloyd Wright was the number one architect who they could name. Number two, this was a running joke then, and it still is many years later, was Mike Brady from the Brady Bunch. He was the number two architect that people could name. So, and then beyond that, there are people most people don't know, and they were probably architects or studied architecture, like Walter Gropius, which we'll talk about him next. Okay, so he went to, I don't know why this does this. It drives me nuts. You're going to find the longer you study the principles and elements of design, the more you care about tiny little things like that. I didn't used to. So he actually he went to school to study engineering, and he dropped out. And he was later given an honorary doctorate because of the work that he did. He first joined the firm of Adler and Sullivan. The more you study, or the more you're around other people in industry, the more you'll hear that name. It was just one of the big firms. At Louis Sullivan, well, we've already looked at, I think we've already looked at a couple of his buildings. So he was given all the residential design work for the firm because at that time, you didn't have to have an architecture degree to be a residential building designer. And technically you still don't. However, it's gotten too difficult to be able to just be able to get hired in the first place now, because the amount of training that has to go into getting you up to speed so that you'll be profitable for the company. Because remember, as we talk about, this is a business. You have to be able to make money. Is so much that it's difficult. So when he left Adler and Sullivan, he had about 50 projects that he had completed. I mean, he was just that prolific with what he did. And so around 1900, his design started to be called prairie houses. They were low buildings with slopes, very gradual slopes. They were very, very vertical, clean lines. He used very large overhangs, which once we get to sustainable design, you'll learn about why that's actually a very sustainable practice in design that he was doing back then. And the design was considered to complement the land around Chicago. He also was the first to start using the open plan, and we'll talk about what that is as we move further into his work. This is one of his original sketches. He did do some commercial buildings, but most of what he did was residential. This is the Sullivan House. I'm sorry, wait a minute. Is that right? I've forgotten the name of this. And I know it like I know my own name, and it just escaped me looking at it. It's in Los Angeles. And he actually started to do work out there. And he got famous. Frank Lloyd Wright became famous, which is something that few architects ever do. And he started to hang out in California, and he hung out with people in Hollywood. And so he started doing work in Los Angeles. And when he got out there, he changed the way his style to fit the landscape of LA because it was much rockier, right? It doesn't look anything like the land in Chicago. And so he used a lot of cinder block, and he really got into the details. And so one of the things you're going to see about him is he designed everything. I have visited two of his sites. I have been to Chicago, and I did a tour of his home and studio there. And then I just did the exterior, walked around the exterior of a couple of his other houses in Chicago. And then I did the full tour out at Spring Green, which is Taliesin, which is his home and studio in Wisconsin. And in one of those tours, I learned he designed everything. He designed the furniture. He designed the silverware. He designed, and when I say everything, I mean everything. And so that's why one of the parts of his genius is that his designs look fully complete. Now, there are people who love him. There are people who hate him. And I don't know that there's a whole lot in between. You either really like him or you really don't. And the people who don't like him, from what I can gather, because I'm not one of them, they don't like the fact that he's become popular. That sort of ruins, in a way, for some people, that sort of ruins the whole idea of being an artist by becoming popular. But I don't know. Other people just don't like his designs. I got to say that I liked him a lot until I went in one of his buildings, and then I just became a fan. The spaces are just magical. That's all I can say. You have to visit one. There's still like 300 of his residences standing, and there is one in Atlanta, and it's on the market. I mean, people live in it, and they sell it periodically, and there are plenty of opportunities, plenty of places to drive to see one of his buildings. He also cared about the interior. He was one of the first modern architects to use the term interior architecture rather than interior design, because he felt that the architect should design the building inside and out. So he was married and divorced multiple times, and he had children, and a lot of stuff happened in his life. He's quite a character. I don't think it would be unfair to call him narcissistic. If he was not a full-blown narcissist, he was very narcissistic. Some of the things he said to clients, I was just like, I've seen letters that he's written to clients, and they're very, very demeaning and gaslighting. So this is one of his buildings that no longer standing. Unfortunately, because buildings are mechanically alive, meaning that if you don't live in them, they deteriorate. People need to be living in them, and the systems need to be running in order for them to and maintained in order for them to persist. A lot of his buildings are starting to wear, tear, and fall apart. And in the case of this building, in Japan, was this one in Japan? This one might have been in California. They they raised it because they couldn't save it in his house. That was the sketch. I don't know why. Anyway, Ennis house. That was it. Ennis. Ennis house. And this is the detail of that concrete block. And sort of he did the stained glass too. And I just love this photo. I'll show you the building that it's it's an overhang with these punches out. Now, you can only get away with this somewhere that doesn't rain a lot, like California, because otherwise rain is going to fall through there and onto your building if the overhang isn't wide enough, which is close. It probably is. But still, and that could be cool too. I mean, if you don't get a lot of rain, having rain run through that could be really cool. And so I've thrown some of his quotes in here just so you can get to kind of know him as a person too. Every great architect is necessarily a great poet. He must be a great original interpreter of his time, his day, his age. I think that goes back to storytelling, I mean, it goes back to you do have to be an interpreter. You have to be able to understand who your client is. You have to be able to interpret the site. You have to be able to interpret style. There's a lot of things that you do have to be able to interpret. Just an example of one of many of his residences that is still standing today. People inhabit. That is somebody's house. He also did some futuristic stuff. You'll see some drawings of his. He did a lot of conceptual, futuristic drawings. Obviously, none of them were built. And then here's a level of detail that pays homage to Art Nouveau without being Art Nouveau. Because Art Nouveau is very organic. There are almost no straight lines, where this is very geometric. This is more it's streamlined modern in a way, because it's the geometry and the wide scale of it, but it's not also. It's Prairie style. This is what he did. He did take elements from the styles that were around him, but he turned them into something completely different so that it is its own style. And just some examples. In one of these, I think it's not here though. I think it's at Falling Water. One of these windows, when you swung it in, the desk was in the way. So he cut out a circle in the or a half circle in the desk, quarter circle in the desk, so that you could open the window. And it worked too. It didn't look like you cut it out. It looked like it was designed that way. So even his accidents he could fix in a way that made them look intentional. He was one of the first architects to design and supply custom-made, purpose-built furniture and fittings that functioned as integral parts of the whole design. And he even would be commissioned later on to go back to earlier designs, to go back in and retrofit them so that they worked. And so one of the things with Prairie houses is you're going to see a lot of repetition. And you'll see that repetition. Sometimes it's formal, sometimes it's different ways of flow. But he nonetheless used a lot of repetition and a lot of pattern. And you see even design these blocks. And what's beautiful is he knew where to put them. So so this is the great part about this. This is rhythm, right? Because he used the repetition, but he also had some that were punched out, some that weren't, and some that were solid. And he knew how to place them in a way that balanced them beautifully. Did his own stained glass. I mean, I don't know that he soldered it on, but he designed it. I'm suspecting he didn't solder it. And then there he is. And as I said, he had a very colorful personal life. He had 3 different marriages. He was always broke, despite the fact that he actually earned a lot of money because he was so high profile and people wanted, it sort of became a trend. Prairie style became a trend. And so he would borrow money from friends and then go spend it on gifts. He just had this charming, charismatic personality that, again, you would see in someone who was narcissistic, and people loved him and they wanted him around, so they were willing to tolerate his behavior. Okay, we'll stop here and continue in the next one.